This is called, this talk was actually figured out really long time ago, like 6 months ago, because you have to apply really far along. And my thought was like, I'm going to give this really high-tech, awesome, cool tech talk where I'm going to, show you how you do procedural generation. But the real answer is that procedural generation is an art. And you can't really teach anybody to be an artist. So all you can do is really, you can teach them what you know, you can give them advice, and you can encourage them. So that's why this is not a hardcore tech talk. I'll show you some tech, because I'm kind of a tech person, but it's really about sort of a larger scope and how we think about procedural generation as a technology for games. So I'm going to go through 3 major approaches to dealing with procedural art. And the first one is to put your procedural generation inside your engine. Now, this is pretty much what everybody usually thinks about when you say procedural art. You think about some really old games that did really cool stuff on really, really tiny pieces of hardware. And I don't have slides, but I have some images, and they're really small images. And the reason they're really small is because it's really, really old. So this is one of the early LucasArts games called Rescue on Fractalus. It's a really crazy game, but basically the idea was that, we'll just write a little algorithm. You don't need to store anything. You don't need to have a massive set of data, which is nice when you have like 64 Ks of memory. You can just generate whatever data you need on the fly. Beautiful. Problem is that we have more than 64K of memory today. And we actually have some round disk-shaped things that we can put in our machines that can store a shitload of stuff. So the real use for procedural generation, the win, is not really there because why would we do it, right? And then the guys who invented this was actually sort of pre-LucasArts stuff. This was like really early. And the guys, Pixar back then was a part of Lucas, there were sprockets back then. And they worked on a lot of stuff like this. And they did rendering, like the first rendering engines for offline rendering. And they thought, well, now we don't need textures. All you have to do is write a little algorithm. And that will solve everything. Well, I love Pixar, but they're wrong. If you want to make something more complex than this, it's not a little algorithm. It's a huge algorithm. It's really, really, really hard. So what's the point? Well, there is no real point, except it's fun. And as much as we like to have fun, that's not really why we're here. A Game Developers Conference is about developing games, and most people make real products and kind of have to ship and boring stuff like that. Just because I'm talking about it, I'm going to show some examples of cool stuff. This is Populous. You've all seen that. Cool story about Populous was that there was a mission disc for Populous. They sold 1.5 million copies of that, and all that mission disc contained was a new random seed. So there is money to be made, but yeah. And here's Elite, which is awesome as well. Kind of, the whole universe on like a tiny computer. Awesome. Here's another screenshot. Here is a game you've never seen before, because I'm like kind of 10 people have seen it. But it's a friend of mine, Scott Campbell, has written this. And he's actually reverse engineered Legend of Zelda, the first one, and made a procedural version. So you can start it up and be like, I want an adventure with 5 castles, I want this and that, and it generates it from scratch. So this is, a layout image. Here's a dungeon. You can see all the dungeons at the top. And here's all the sort of things you can grab, all the little missions you have. And yeah, everything's generated. It's awesomely cool. And as far as I know, there's 2 copies of this game in existence. Robert's got one. Scott Robertson's got one. And he apparently showed this to somebody at Nintendo, and the person got back to them like 2 weeks later and was like, Miyamoto would like a copy. So he sent them a copy and haven't heard from them since. So if you all email Nintendo, they might actually release this. That would be awesome because I want to play it. Here's some other games they're working on to, how to figure stuff out. But basically, I believe that this is a dead end. It's a fun dead end if you're if you're making unserious games or small games or things like that. But basically, it doesn't really solve the problems that we have in the game industry today. So, what kind of problems do we have? Well, we have this problem that games are kind of expensive to make. And most of our money goes into this thing called assets. Ooh. How about we could deal some there? And there are actually some people doing this. And the nice thing about not having it in the engine is that it doesn't have to be perfect. Imagine, the first people who did this were the guys who did Massively, which is kind of a crowd simulation system for movies. And it was actually developed for Lord of the Rings when they had all the fights. So with those guys, there were people doing crowd simulations before that, but what they did was crowd simulate, and then you got a file that you rendered. And to get, 1,000 guys to look right is really, really hard, because there's always one of them that's going to do something that looks really stupid. So what these guys figured out is no, let's not do it like that. Let's have all the generation happen and then be able to put it back into our normal editing tools, our modeling tools. So then we can go in and, here's our shot. I just want to move this guy's head because he's in the way, right? And then you can get massive amounts of work done without actually having to do it yourself, right? And you can still have the power to fix things, which is awesome. There's a lot of people doing things like that. EVE Online is doing a lot of procedural stuff, kind of easy game to do it in. It's like rocks in space. They aren't really intelligently ordered. So it kind of works out really well. Far Cry 2 is another game that did a lot of this. When you're faced with a problem of placing, 100 million blades of grass, you say, well, are we going to hire an army of artists to do this? Or maybe we can write some kind of tool that does it procedurally. But this is kind of my little beef with how people deal with tools. Because tools is kind of what everyone in the game industry hates to do, because it's not something you ship. It's something you do, and then you do your project, and then you throw it away, right? So it's kind of pointless. When do you do tools? When you do tools, when you hit the wall, right? When you realize we can't ship this game without making something. So it's like, Greg, go do something. I don't care. Just make something work. We got to ship, right? And I work alone, so I make a game completely alone. So just by waking up in the morning, I walk into a wall, basically. I can't do anything. So I'm really, really, really focused on tools because that helps me be productive. And when I then look at these tools and see, what have I created? I see wow, this is really what mainstream developers should use too. If they worked like I did and started with the tools, they wouldn't have to spend all that money on all those artists, and they could iterate faster so they could make better games. So that would be awesome. So, one thing you need to do, how many people here went to my talk last year? Oh, that's not many people. You get to vote, because I got a 5.0. The other guys? I don't know. So last year, I did I bitched a little bit. And my target for last year was designers. I explicitly told everyone to fire all their designers. This year, artists. Because the problem with artists is that they want to do everything. They want to sit and tinker with everything forever. So actually, taking the tools away from them and saying, no, we're going to have a programmer do it. That's a really, really scary thing. And you need to really have brave artists to be able to implement a pipeline that has procedure generation in it. Because your artists are going to go bonkers about it. So, this is really something that artists have, I love artists, I am an artist, but you guys are just wrong. And you need to learn that in order to make games today that keeps getting bigger, keeps getting higher requirements in terms, we got higher amount of bandwidth and everything gets faster. We can draw more stuff on screen, more polygons. We can't just do everything as we used to do it because we're basically, killing ourselves financially. And especially since, how do you make a good game? Well, the number one way to make a good game is to make a bad game and then fix it and fix it and fix it and fix it and fix it. If you just keep fixing stuff, eventually you'll hopefully end up with a good game. You got to have a really, really bad start idea to have a game you can't salvage. So to be able to iterate, you really need to have a fast turnaround on your art pipeline because that's kind of the expensive part. So one of those artists that I kind of love is Ken Levine. And I'm going to riff off something he said. And he basically said that we have it so difficult in the game industry. I mean, look at the movie guys. If they want to make a movie, they make a movie. We, as developers, we have to start building a camera. We can't focus on the game because we're building the goddamn camera. And I love you. I love you so much, but you're wrong. Because if you look at the filmmakers who built cameras, there are people like Stanley Kubrick and Coppola or Lucas. And I think there's been like some new movie out that's made some money that had some like new camera technology. If we look at the past, we start realizing, hey, it's the guys who are interested in camera technology that make the artistic movies. Because the people who push the envelope in technology tends to be the people who also push the envelope when it comes to, art and what you can do with the technology. So that's why I think that people should get much, much more focused on technology, not as some sort of means to an end, but actually explore it and see where it takes you rather than just as something you have to do to ship a game. So let's do a demo. That's fun. Let's do a demo. So here's some tools. You saw maybe if you were watching, I was modeling a little bit before. Move my mouse. Click. So I'm going to show you a couple of tools. Right now on this machine, I'm using Verse, which is my network protocol. I could give a talk about that, but I'm not gonna. But I'm going to bring up my modeling tool. So this is my beautiful, beautiful modeling tool. And here we go. I'm going to select an object. This is a gun for my game. So this is, one of the assets. I'll place it over here. And I'm going to show you a technique this is kind of a feature that I did in this application about 5 years ago. So it's really old. But let's make this larger for now. But this is something I call deploy. And this little technique actually turned into my game. And this is something you can use. I'm going to talk more about in detail in the future, but I want to do it now because I'm going to do the demos. So here's a piece of geometry. I'm going to select this edge here, and I'm going to use select hull. So that basically selects all the edges, the next edge and the next all the way around. I'm going to do the same here. Okay, so now all the polygons on this side are selected. Okay, you can see this wing thing here. I'm going to click on the back of this wing, and I'm going to choose deploy. Boom. Now, this function is really simple, right? You can all figure out what happened. It basically took this piece of geometry and sort of glued it on. It removed the polygons and put them together. Now, this is an incredibly powerful tool because it allows your artists to make little fragments of things, right? You make a hole in the ground. You make a tree. You make, a little edge that has been rubbed off or something like that. And that allows the artists to do what the artist should do, which is to art direct, right? The only thing they don't have to do is do the volume. And it's really the volume that kills us in game development, right? It's the volume that makes it really, expensive. So this way, you can have control, which you didn't have in, the old school games where you basically said, well, generate everything, right? Here you have artist-driven, but you at the same time have this really sort of powerful way of building stuff. And this also means that you have a surface that you can populate with things. So you can have a ground surface, for instance, and maybe the ground surface is a height field, and a height field you can dynamically change while the players are playing, so you have a dynamic world, but you can still put real object onto it that sort of fit into the ground and things like that. So this is kind of a direction that I am personally going in, that you can really sort of start doing some hybrid between generating stuff and hand model stuff. And if you start thinking about it, how you actually fit this thing, there's a bunch of different ways, how you stretch it, how you fit it. You can make a bunch of options. You can do it recursively, right? So I can do, say, a little, dent. And the dent would be on the wings here, right? So you can do, and then on the dent, I can make smaller dents, right? And actually, if you build an engine out of it, you can even use that for a level of detail and things like that. So this kind of basic technology is a really, really nice sort of starting point for building some kind of primitive that we can use to generate really interesting environments that look hand-modeled and look really sort of attentive to detail, except we can make them a lot faster. So last year I showed you this, but since nobody watched it, we'll show it again. So here is the gun again. Here we go. Here's my sweet gun. And here is my UV mapping tool. It looks a little better than it did last year. Because last year I'd worked on it for about 2 weeks. And now I've worked on it almost 3. So it's like, it's completed. So this is my UV mapping tool. So I'm going to select the object that I want to UV map. That's the object. And I've actually UV mapped it. That was it. And if you don't believe me, I can start modifying, and the UV mapping happens in real time. So this is probably, 10, 15, maybe even 20% of your art budget out the window, just by writing a little algorithm that, does it for you. So this is really kind of a very simple example of our procedural in your art pipeline is kind of nice. Although this isn't fun. This is last year. My game is going to be released the 25th, so I've been kind of crunching. Got 2 weeks left, basically, and I'm here. It's crazy. But I thought, you don't want to go to Game Developers Conference without showing something new. Oh, and that's something new, but something different. That doesn't have a quick button, but it's got a crash button. Very good. Here we go. Now we're going to... There we go. See, it doesn't have any nice graphics in the beginning or anything. It's like, what is this? There we go. So now, I have the same object here. And obviously I have a texture map here, but it's kind of boring. So let's actually texture map this thing. So I'm going to add a remap texture to this. This is kind of gray, right? I'm going to turn off the lighting. And it's remapped, so I can actually change the colors of it. So I'm going to make this kind of some sort of rust color. I don't know. Something like that, maybe. So now this is really rusty, ugly. But obviously it's been painted, so let's paint it. Really ugly color. So let's choose some other color for the paint, something like that. But then the paint has gotten kind of shipped, right? So it started to crack like this. Yeah, this starting to look good. Maybe it's cracked not just in the edges, so something like this. So now we have an old gun. But it looks really clean. That's bad. Let's put some dirt on it. Oh, there we go. So let's change the dirt. Maybe a little bit less dirt, something like that. Or maybe it's underwater. So, ooh, it's green. That was really ugly. Let's not do that. Let's do something like this. Oh, this looks better. And maybe a little bit less. Here we go. So now you can see there's like the dirt has gathered here in the cavities and things like that. This is actually running on the actual compositing of this happens on the graphics card. So I can do like real-time 4K textures and just, go crazy. And of course, it's all layered, so you can go back. I changed my mind. I want a different color or whatever. So it's really nice. And I mean, this is a very simple prototype, obviously, so it's not as cool as you would make it. This is 1 week's worth of work, but I'm betting you that it would take probably, a couple hours to do this for an artist by hand. And, of course, I'm an equal opportunity hater, but there's one special breed that has a special place in my heart, and that's obviously producers. Because when you've done all this job, the producer comes to you and says, "Oh, I didn't want to bother you when you were working so hard on the texturing, but could you just change the model?" And then it's like, okay, but I have to UV map and retexture. I have to start all over again. But that's not a problem because we go in here, we change, and yeah, it just works. So yeah, shorter barrel, longer barrel. Real time. So obviously you can add a bunch of more features where you can select areas. This is only color right now. It doesn't do bump mapping and speculars and stuff like that. So obviously you can add lots of cool things. I want to have like a particle thing so I can like splatter things with dirt. And you can put a particle emitter by a wheel of a car, and then you sort of get the spray on the side of the car and things like that. It'd be really easy to do actually. So I think that's my demo for now. Okay, we'll let that. Fine. So last year, I was actually, there was a really great talk about Red Faction. Anyone who went to it? Anyone here from Volition? No, of course. It was a great talk. And they basically said that it was, about all the trials of making a destructible game. They had to make make little pieces out of everything and put them back together, make the physics engine understand that and switch them in and out, and all these really, really, really tricky things. And they went through this really hellhole of doing all that. And at the end of the talk, they said, well, one thing that we've really proven with this is that it is really hard, but with the level of technology we have already, you don't have to wait for the next generation. You can make a destructible game. And I was just thinking, what about Super Mario Brothers? That game was from the 80s, and the entire game is like destructible. Why isn't every game today destructible? If we could make them destructible in the 80s. We got all the hardware, and we got all the, cool tools and stuff we didn't have back then. But they made it destructible, and we can't do it. And, well, Volition can do it, but they spend all their life, killing themselves to do it. So that made me think that Volition is actually wrong. They didn't prove that you could do it because of the hardware, but despite the hardware. And if you start thinking about it, if you start looking at the old Zelda game, that's a really playable game today. And if you compare that to, say, Resident Evil 5, it actually is, in some ways, gameplay terms, actually more advanced. It's open world. It's got, destructibility. You can set things on fire. You can do all these kinds of things that you really can't do in a lot of modern games. Now, why is that? Well, it's actually because the art today has sort of raised the bar. So in order to make something destructible, that's not the problem. The problem is to make the destructible stuff look good. And to do this in a Mario game is super simple. I mean, it's not high tech because it's like a grid, right? You have a list of what's in each grid block, right? You say, oh, here's a block, and then, well, we destroy it. Well, we'll remove it, put some air in there, done. It's super simple. So you can do that, but you can't do that today because today we have like just random polygon meshes coming out of Maya, right? And they don't destroy really well. And that's why I think that you need to be really powerful in your argument for procedural generation at a really early stage and basically say, we're going to make an ugly game. We're going to make a game that has all these limitations that creates new opportunities for us, that makes it possible for us to do destructibility, to do, whatever we want in the game, right? And we're going to set these really strict rules. We're not going to just let you go hog wire in Maya or Max or whatever. We're going to do something different. We're going to build an engine that is based on this. And I was talking to Chris Hecker, actually, just the other night. I don't know if you know him. He's like really cool guy, programmer, and he basically said, he worked on Spore, amongst other things, and he basically said that, tech is really fun and stuff like that, but we kind of solved all the tech problems. So now we should just screw the tech and start thinking about gameplay, because gameplay is more important, right? We don't need better looking games. And I really think he's wrong. I love you, Chris, but you're wrong. Because the thing is that we pushed the tech in one direction, which is looking good, but we did not push the technology in order to make gameplay. You know, some gameplay we can talk about interface design. Should the button be blue or green? We don't need tech for that. You know, we need MS Paint to do that. But in order to do the more advanced stuff, we actually have to think about this. And if you look back at like the early engines we have, like the Doom engine, which has all these limitations that were there just because, you know, we couldn't do 3D, but if we did this hack, we kind of can do something that looks like 3D almost. You can't look up or down, but hey, it kind of works, right? And it turns out that a lot of people made mods for that. They did, you know, lots of levels and things like that because it was so easy. Why was it easy? Because it was limited, right? And today, if you make a moddable game, you know, the mod scene is kind of going away because the games have gotten so damn complicated to make assets for. And that kind of stifles the mod community, but the mod community is no different from us, from developers, right? We can't do stuff. And that's why we really need to think when we develop our technology, how are we going to make gameplay by putting limitations on our systems and build our tech around that. So that kind of brings me to the third way of doing procedural generation. And the third way is the way that I do it. And the third way is to put it back into the engine. Now you may say, wait a minute, didn't you say that was a really stupid idea? Yes, it is a really stupid idea, because it's hard as hell. And the reason it's hard as hell is because you don't get to fix anything. There is no margin for error, right? If you make some stupid code that makes some stupid thing, you fail, right? But there is an upside to it. Think about this. What do you like the most? Do you like a human-made animation where somebody dies in a game? Like, you know, really well animated. Or do you like a ragdoll? Well, the ragdoll is usually a lot better because when I shoot somebody, I want them to fall in a way that reflects how I killed them. And the animator, no matter how good the animator is, can't sit next to me and be like, whoa, 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 you gotta pause the game. I gotta animate this shit, you know? And be like, oh, now, okay, you should fall over here. Okay, now you can play. Oh, didn't look great, right? We can't do that, right? But we can do a ragdoll simulation because a ragdoll happens while the player is actually playing. So if you want to make games that are truly dynamic, if you want to make storytelling in game, that isn't storytelling, but actually story creation, where the player is not, you know, making a choice, do you want to kill this person or do you want him to live? And there's like A, B, right? And then, you know, branch, and then he dies immediately after, even if you don't kill him, just because it's so expensive to make two branches that you gotta sort of put them back together again. It's like, oh, well, he died anyway. Let's continue with the story. You know, that's kind of how games are today, I mean, more or less. And some people put like massive amounts of content in them to try to branch them out a little bit. But it really doesn't work, right? In order to really make cool games, we have to branch and figure out the branches and the content while the player is playing. Because only then do we know what assets we really need. So this is kind of, to me, the holy grail of gaming. And I've been working on this for a long time. I think I'm ahead of most of you. I don't know what you're doing in your basements. It might be really cool. But I think that this is kind of one of those points where we could add something really cool to the gaming community, where before and after would be like, it would kind of make, old games feel really old. Like Doom feels really old when you got real 3D. It's like I can look up and down. And, when you take that away and go back to Doom, it's like, wow, this really is different. Doom is still a great game, but it's kind of, it's this generational leap where older stuff really starts feeling old very quickly. So let's talk about how you would do this. Because the complexity of it really is going to kill you. A game today is so complex that it's really hard to write an algorithm for it. So, let's say I give you like a 101 course in how to make games procedurally. And I would tell you something like, okay, you got a square, I want you to make a labyrinth, and there's an entrance and there's an exit. How would you go about solving that problem? Well, here's how I would do it. I would basically draw some sort of random thing through from the beginning to the end. That's what I would start with. Now, I know that the problem is solvable, right? And then I just look at all the empty space around it, and I start filling it with blinders, right? They can just go wherever, I just fill up the surface, right? Done, right? I know that this is a solvable system because I started out with a solution, right? And that's kind of how people think about it. The problem with that is when you get into complexity. To illustrate this, I brought a prop. It's my key. This is my home key. I only have one key. That tells you a little bit about the level of complexity in my life, I guess, the level of responsibility. But this is my key. And a key is a really basic thing you have in games. It might actually be a key, but it might also not be a key. Like, for instance, it might be the Triforce, right? Something you have to collect in order to get into Ganon's castle. Or it might be 30 pelts of some creature, right? But they're kind of keys. Because we build up games saying, basically, here's your area, here's your limitations. You got to get to this level. You got to do this thing. You got to complete this quest in order to get to the next thing, right? So you can actually think of a game, you could plot a game, most games at least, like with a bunch of sort of walls that you need keys to. And you got to make sure that the key is on the outside of the wall, otherwise you'll never get in, right? And that's kind of what game testers sit around doing all day, right? It's like, well, if I do this before that, and I lock this, then, well, that closes, so I can never get that thing that I need to complete, so the game is broken, right? That's kind of what you do. This key, on the other hand, is a real key. And it's a little bit more interesting. If I lost this key, would that be the end of my apartment? Would my apartment forever be boxed in, and in thousands and thousands of years, nobody would enter? No. There's other ways of getting in my apartment. I can actually do it without this key in a real smart way I'm not going to tell you about. But I can call a locksmith. I can do all kinds of things, right? There's all these possibilities of getting into my apartment that doesn't involve this key. It doesn't mean that I don't want this key. Somebody says, well, you don't need it. Can I have it? No, you can't have it because it's a really useful tool. But it's not the only tool, right? And the same thing is, let's say I dropped this key and you found it on the street out here. Would you be like picking it up and it's like, I found the key. My life's mission is to find the door. Because I know that my whole life will not continue until I find the door. It's really, really important, right? You wouldn't. You'd probably not even pick it up. You'd be like, oh, somebody lost their key. That's really sad. Somebody's crying right now. But you wouldn't care, right? You couldn't do anything with the key. Because the world is full of keys and the world is full of locks, right? And it's kind of, that's really how life is, right? If you don't get that job that you really want, if you don't, if your game is canceled, if terrible things happen, that's not the end of your life. That's what's so great about the life, is that you can find other solutions, right? You can always improvise. Now, improvisation, in my mind, is what I want my players to do. I want them to be able to improvise. So, let's say we're modeling a city. Let's say we're modeling San Francisco. And let's say we're making an assassin game. Just looking at the people in this room, if everybody here would empty their pockets, just their pockets, we would find keys to, I bet, a whole lot of hotels around here. We would probably find a lot of contacts to a lot of people in phones. We would find ID cards. We maybe even find 1 or 2 passports that we could travel with. The opportunities for an assassin to use the things that are in this room are kind of endless, right? And if I were an assassin who's trying to kill somebody, I could just pickpocket all of you, and I would probably get, access to the hotel of the victim, or maybe cross the street so I could snipe them, or maybe some of you go to the same dermatologist as this guy I'm going to kill, so I can, figure out your schedule, and I can take your place, or whatever, right? There's all these possibilities, right? And how do you make sure that the world is consistent? Well, you can't, right? Because the world is so damn complex, right? So what you start doing instead is start to build engines that are opportunistic. So let's say I build a house. The normal thing in a game would be to put a key and a door, and you got to get the key in order to get in the door. But what I do is I put 5 doors on the house. And where do I put the keys? Well, in programming terms, I might just put them in a list somewhere. Say, okay, here's keys. If I ever create, say, a pocket, I'll put one of the keys into them. I don't care. I'll just take one, right? And if that pocket happens to be in a pair of jeans that is inside the house, that means that it's kind of broken, right? I can't get to the key without, it's broken, right? But the whole thing is that I'm going to put 5 different of them. So the chance that there will be no way to get into the building doesn't really matter, right? Because statistically, it's going to work out. And actually, if you can't get into the house, that's going to be fine too. Because whatever you look for in the house is going to be somewhere else as well. So the opportunity to go into the house is really about the player figuring out, hey, what can I do? Can I figure out a way? Now, if my algorithm is broken, so let's say I built a house, but it's only got 3 walls. And I put this mountainous door with like super locks, it's like bomb-proof, and it's like really, really good. Except I forgot to build one of the walls. The whole puzzle that I put there is completely broken. Because anybody's going to be like, hey, I just walked through the hole, right? And in life, that would be a disaster. And in games, that would be a disaster because you would have spent a lot of time to build that door, right? But if it's procedural, it's free. And the players who will actually come up to the hole will be like, I'm so fucking smart. I'm using the hole, right? So they'll feel like brilliant people. So actually, your bugs will become features. Just like when you went down there and you got a lunch, even though you didn't register for it. You feel like, yeah, I did it, right? It's awesome. And it's a winnable because you got to be creative, right? You got to beat the system. And that can actually be part of your game. So, really, this is kind of why I named the session what I named it to. You got to be really, really open to randomness. And be like, I'm fine with the fact that I don't know whether or not it's possible to get into the store. I don't know, but that's fine. I can live with that. Because I build a system that is built to be dynamic, where there's no requirements that things are consistent. And this makes for a far, far more interesting world. So, let's have a little demo. No, let's not. Let's wait. So there's basically, in procedural talking, you talk about deterministic. And deterministic is this idea that you have some sort of function, and you give it a bunch of input, and you always get the same output. So that's like saying, I want to know what's on this specific point, right? What's the ground like? And if you use something like a Perlin noise, you can just ask, what's here? And you get that. And it doesn't require any storage because the function itself can sort of figure out what's there, disregarding what's around it. Now that works really well for simple things like, landscapes and things like that. But if you want to build really complex things, that's really hard to do. Like this staircase here, it's really hard to figure out that this staircase needs to be here without actually knowing that, there's a high ground next to it, right? Because the high ground and the low ground sort of are the keys that make us understand that, hey, might be a good place to put the staircase, right? So what I say is that you should actually apply filters instead. And this is where you actually get into like image manipulation strategies. Like, what a blur is. It takes surrounding pixels and it averages them together, and then you get a blur, right? Really simple stuff. But that's kind of how you would do this, is you would look at this one, you would be here and say, okay, I'm at a high ground here. Can I check my neighbor? Whoa, it's really low there, okay? So let's step down. Let's start feeling down this direction and say, whoa, okay, I'm touching the ground at this. If I go this angle down, I'm going to touch the ground. And then I'm going to go out a little bit and see there's not a wall here, right? Because, on that side there is a staircase. But let's assume there wasn't a staircase there. If the wall is too close, I can't build a staircase. So you start feeling your way out. And then you're like, oh, yeah, this is probably a good place for a staircase, right? So you build these opportunistic systems that just looks at your world. In my world, I have a block-based world, but I have 100,000 blocks. And it turns out that often searching everything can't be done. So what do? Well, you trust chaos. You do a stochastic sampling, which basically means you take some random places and you say, I'm going to test this place, this place, this place, and this place and see if I can build a bridge. They might be completely the wrong places, but I don't care. I'm just going to try some random stuff and then see what I find. So that means that I might miss something, but I can also find something, right? And this actually sounds really scary. It's like, no, we got to test everything, but it works out pretty well. And back in the 80s, Disney were talking to Pixar. This was really early 80s. And they said basically that you guys are never going to make a good movie. And here's why. Because computers, they don't understand feelings. Computers can never make something that you feel about, feel happy, or, they don't have understanding of the human condition. And as much as we love Disney, they were wrong. How were they wrong? Well, because they forgot that computers are actually operated by humans. So anything that you as a designer can think of, instead of designing the staircase, you can explain to the computer why you think it's good to have a staircase here. And when you do that, like for instance in my game I have bridges, right? Lots of bridges. So I started out saying, okay, what is a bridge? Well, it's some place where, land basically stops, right? And there's a hole, and you have some place on the other side that you can build to, right? That's kind of what I need, right? And then I started putting all these rules, like, okay, I can't have like a tree sticking up in the middle, because it's going to stick right through my bridge. I don't want this to be like a bridge from one spot, and then, there's a natural formation, so I could just walk by it, right? So it looks like a pointless bridge, right? I want a bridge where there's really two different areas. So I started adding these rules. And I looked at my world, and I was like, I can't see a single spot where this bridge would actually work. I mean, the whole world is so random. It's like, I have all these strict rules. I had like 50 different things that had to be correct in order to build a bridge. I was like, this is never going to work, but I'm going to try it. So I built it, and the entire world is just bridges everywhere. And I'm looking at it, it's like, damn. And when I see it, it's like, oh yeah, there's a bridge. I didn't think of that one. And, oh, here's a bridge. I didn't think of that one. And here's a bridge. And you start, wow, there's too many bridges. And you realize, like, oh, half of them are really, really stupid. And then you start saying, well, this bridge. You look at a specific one. I don't want that bridge. And you say, why don't I want that bridge? Well, because it's connected in this way. It's too thin. You know, it's too thin and too short. You could just jump over, right? So then I put more rules in. It's like, no, it's got to be long enough. It's got to be wide enough. It's got to be, it's got to have nice places for the pillars and blah, blah, blah. You put, 100 rules instead of 50. And then you turn on and you get too many bridges still. So after a while you say, these bridges are all great. I'm just going to have to do some measurements, see, which is the best bridge. I'm saying the widest and the longest bridges are the best. Except they should never be longer than this. Okay, that's my, and they should be kind of level. I don't want bridges that go too much high, And then I do that, and I find, 1,000 bridges, but I only want 10, so I take the 10 best bridges. And when I actually do this, it turns out that the design made by the computer becomes a lot better than I could do it. Because if I were designing this world, I wouldn't consider every possible place to put a bridge. I would just look at it and do the obvious ones. So when I start playing the game, I'm like, wow, it did that thing. That was really smart. I would never thought of that. And that's actually where you take the designer and the code and the brute force that the computer has that we don't have and merge them together. So one of the things I do in my game is I have power relays, which basically I have a power source and I have something that needs power. So I got to route this power thing, right? And it's got to have a clear line of sight between each, relay, basically. So how do you do that? Well, you could try every option possible, but since there's 100,000 of them, not going to work, going to eat your CPU. So what I do is I basically just take like a stone and throw it. Say, how about there? This is the direction I'm going. Further away would be nice, and somewhere over there. And I try line of sight, and it's like, nope, didn't work. Well, throw the stone a little bit shorter, a little bit closer, and a little bit more random, right? So it could be a little bit more to the side, right? And then I try that. Didn't work. And then I go closer and closer where I'm aiming, but also sort of wider, right? So after a while, I might actually throw it backwards, even if I'm going that way. Because that might be the good decision, right? And by doing this sort of sampling, it turns out that they built some amazing bridges. Like if there's a tunnel, they'll draw in the tunnel power lines and really, really intricate stuff that's like my players hardly build because, it's so advanced actually. So this is a really, really powerful way of building a world. And when you look at the world, it doesn't look as if somebody designed it. It has a sort of free-form feeling that you get from the real world, where, it doesn't, when you walk out into the city, it doesn't look like one designer did everything. It's like some different people had some different ideas, and, some things didn't work out, so they tore down some buildings, built some new ones, and, changed it a little bit. That's kind of how the environment starts looking. So maybe we should move on. Yes. Yeah, let's do a demo, because it's so fun. More demos. So, first, I'm not going to talk about love very much. On release, the 25th, go by. But I'm going to show it to you just to show you actually the engine, because the engine is really interesting. Here we go. Now, one of the bad things about doing demos in Love is that I have no idea what the world looks like because I didn't build it. But looks like this little settlement here is still active. I did some demos earlier today. So I'm going to bring up my cheat menu. And so the world is block-based. You can see actually when I move this cursor, you can see the blocks. They're kind of well hidden. But I can pull up a block like this, right? So that means that each block has 4 corners and 4 height values, basically. And then, I can pull up the next one. And each of these blocks actually can be cut, so you can make a hole in them. So I can just walk up to a wall like this one and start cutting like this, right? And now I actually just say to the engine, okay, make a hole in this one, and I add 4 more positions, which is the ground floor, and 4 more, which is sort of the ceiling, right? And I can, obviously I can grab one of those. So they're all dynamic, right? So this is kind of a simple structure for storing data, right? It's kind of a primitive that is limited in some ways. I can't build, thin walls. Every wall has to be 1 block thick, right? But I have a lot of flexibility. So for instance, you can see right now that I'm actually building. There, as far as I know, not very many games where you can do what I do right now, which is just grab the environment and let your players build stuff. Now, what's nice also is that when I grab one of these, now this one happens to be a block, so it's really square. But if you look at this one, it's really not square at all. How come? Well, because I hand modeled a block that is square, right? And then I put all these dents and stuff into it. And then basically I say, engine, if you have like a block that is alone, standing up, don't draw like a block. Draw this one. Take this geometry that I made and add it instead, right? And that's how I can art direct the rock formations without actually having to build, the world. So let's walk over here. Here you can see, here's an edge, right? And this edge has been shipped. So this is a model, actually, that I modeled. I think it's like 12 polygons large. But it tells the engine, this is how I want you to be able to draw a corner. Here's another corner. Looks a little bit weirder. It's actually an edge object. And they're all sort of squished, right? So that's how I sort of can squish in this geometry. And when I started making the engine, I was like, okay, I'm going to have to sit down. And when I make these rock formations, I'm going to have to make like 30, 40 different corners, right? So that I get the diversion that I want. But it turns out, since they're all squished and mushed and, not completely the same, I only had to make like 4. And after that, I kind of didn't need any more because they didn't look the same. And actually, you can see all the trees here. They're actually the exact same model. But they don't look the same. You get the feeling that they are actually from the same species, but they don't have that sort of carbon copy look where you can just see, oh yeah, they copied and pasted here. So, and obviously I can now place objects in the world. So, let's build some random stuff. What do I want to build? I'll just build this one just because it's fun. So here's an object, basically, boom. And now I put some dynamic graphics, which uses my cloth simulation. So this kind of shows you really how easily the environment is editable, but also at the same time that this model is, hand modeled, so I can really go to town with the hand model stuff and really art direct as much as I want. So, you get stuff like here, staircase, obviously hand modeled, but it's like 12 polygons or whatever, so it's really easy to do. And let's see if I find some more time at the end. I'll show you some more of love, because it's fun. Oh, I only have 5 minutes left. I'm screwed. But I want to show you one more thing. So actually, let's show a little bit how the world works from an outside point of view. No, let's not do that. Let's do that one. So this is an outside view of my world. My world is a planet, and you can see that I've actually divided the world into these little patches. And now I'm running the game 10,000 times faster in real time. So you can see the patches sort of moving up and down. That's actually the change that goes on in the world. So the players will constantly have something new to look at. You can see there's a bridge there. It's kind of nice. And what I do basically is that I have rules that basically says, I'm at this height, what are my neighbors like? Well, they're lower, so I'm going to go lower because maybe I'm in an area that's kind of flattish, Or, if there's one area is a canyon, so that they basically have the rule that you should be really high, except if you got a neighbor that is low. And if you have a neighbor that is low, you should start to reconnect with them to build a canyon. If you got 2 neighbors that are low, you should connect them. But if you got 3 neighbors that are low, you're sort of at the edge of a canyon, so don't make it low. So you build those kind of rules, and this is kind of deterministic. So at any point in the game, I can basically say, this block, where should it be? And that's really important, because that means you've got a base that you can build stuff on. And that also means especially that you can destroy anything and go back to something that was there before. A lot of people tell me, how do you build stuff? How do you build stuff? That's not the problem. Destroying stuff is a lot harder. Not the actual player destruction, that's simple, but actually having the thing sort of degrade, because the world gets full of crap after a while, because people have been shooting and destroying and building and, so there'd be ruins everywhere, and it's kind of unplayable. So you need to sort of go back somewhere. So to have a ground level is really nice. So let's show this one. So this one actually shows you the cities, and they are actually more like filters. So, for instance, a building in my game is actually a number of filters. It's basically a filter that makes a box. And then there's a filter that makes whatever you put it on hollow. And then there's a filter that looks in hollow things and sees if there's good places for doors. And then there's another filter that looks at hollow things and sees, are there good places for windows? So I don't really have a plan when I start it. I just, start running these filters over. And it's really nice because I did a test where I basically took a mountain and I say, make hollow, make a building, right? And it started putting, windows on the mountain. Really cool, right? And it's really, really flexible way of working. So filter is really, really where you want to get your more advanced geometry. So here you can see all the characters running around. So this game actually allows me to make a game that is incredibly dynamic. The AI, if you're getting attacked by AI in your settlement, they're actually walking throughout the world and finding you. And the path finding them, that is pretty hard problem, obviously, because they walk throughout the entire world. And even if you make a path, the path might not be there when you get there because the world's actually changing while you're walking. Luckily, it's a dynamic world, so the AI can actually build bridges over things. They can also tunnel through things. So they can get to places where they normally wouldn't because the world is dynamic. So you run into all kinds of problems, but you also run into all kinds of really, really cool solutions. So, finally, last year I was here and I walked around, and I've been working on this alone for 3 years. And I felt really, really lost. And the reason was that every session I went into, they were talking about things that didn't bother me or that were different. Like, what kind of build servers do you have? Well, I use C, not C++, so all the builds are fast. What kind of file storage you use? Well, I use Verse as a networking protocol, so everything's real time. I don't need files, right? I keep doing everything differently, and I felt, damn, something's wrong here. And then I was having dinner with somebody, and we were comparing our games, and we had the same set of features, like comparatively, they had some features I didn't have, and but they had 10 times as much code as I had. And I was like, what am I doing wrong? Am I missing something? I don't know. So I kind of felt bewildered. And then I heard all these people saying lots of things, like you've probably heard this thing. PC, by the way, is dead. And then I used to say, well, what about Steam? Well, they're different. They don't count. And then you say, well, it's got to be free to play. That's the only way of doing an MMO. And you're like, well, what about World of Warcraft? Well, it's Blizzard. They're different. And then you say, well, you got to sell through on your first day because games don't last for long. Well, what about all those DS games that keep selling every month? The Mario Kart. Well, that's Nintendo. They don't count. How about, peripheral? Well, you can't have peripherals because they're like real expensive and things like. Well, what about guitar? Well, they don't count. And what I realized is, I really don't want to count. When I don't count, that's when I know that I really succeeded. Thank you. So, if there's something I really want you guys to come away with here, it's that you should go out and explore. And look at this and say, well, here's some really interesting things he did. And I don't agree with them, but they're kind of different. And I'm going to go in this direction. I'm going to go in that direction. And hopefully, you're all going to come up to me next year and say, Eskil, I love you, but you're wrong. And that's when I think you will make some really, really great games. Thank you.